So we started 3 weeks ago this conversation called Overcomer, and I said it feels a little strange to talk about this thing Overcomer. Like, what are we overcoming? We live in one of the nicest areas in the country, probably. We're in some of the safest parts of the country. To be very honest with you, there's abundance of good things about this place that we live in, this North Dallas area. But the problem is, even those of us who live in a really, really nice area, right? Here's what we do. We get caught in a trap. And we start this internal conversation, or somehow it comes up, or it's just something that seems to be stuck in us, that we're always comparing. We're always looking at everybody else. We're always looking at their stuff, their place in life, their personalities even. You've got a friend that maybe you just admire how outgoing they are, because maybe that's not you. Maybe you're very inward focused, and you don't want to be on stage makes you break out in a sweat to even think about it. And maybe you think, man, if I could just be more outgoing. We compare ourselves so much, and we come out on the other end of comparison in a really bad place, right? That internal conversation starts going on, and it's unhealthy, I said. In fact, the first week I said, when you start to compare like that, what's going to happen? It's going to kill any chance of contentment you ever have in your life. And along with contentment, what's going to happen then is it's going to start to shift your focus off the identity, who you're really supposed to be. And eventually, what's going to happen is you're going to just start creating categories in your world. Now, categories are really normal, right? We use them to communicate things. But the problem with categories is they can often constrain our future. They'll keep us from being who we really should be as time goes on. Today, I want to talk, for the last week, I want to talk about this idea of comparison and what happens when you start to look around and fear starts to creep into your life because of what you're seeing. Now, it's not always what you're seeing. Sometimes fear comes up in our lives just because of certain threats or certain things that are scary. But often, even in those moments when we fear certain things, you know what happens? We compare again, and our fears grow. Donald Miller tells a story in his book, Blue Like Jazz, a great book kind of where he explores God a little bit deeper after living in a life of Christianity that he couldn't rectify. He was just messing with it and turning it over and over, and he couldn't figure out what faith was really supposed to be. And he writes about that journey in this book called Blue Like Jazz. In it, he tells a story pretty early in the book about a jazz singer of his, a folk singer. And he went to see and hear this person sing. And on stage one night, they started telling a story about their friend. They have a friend who was a Navy SEAL. The story goes like this, that this friend's Navy SEAL, their team was called into action. They went on a mission. And it was one of those you don't get to talk about, right? They went somewhere in the world to land somewhere in a bad place to liberate some people who had been held captives for a very long time. They were prisoners. So the team launches into the mission, arrives at the compound, does their thing, and finally makes it to the room, the cell, where this group of people, I don't know how many, were being held. And so the SEAL team immediately breaks the door open, and standing in the doorway announces who they are to these prisoners. And the guy said the immediate response was, they moved away from us. He said, in fact, they moved all the way back to the corners. They all huddled together, and they just shrank in fear to the floor. He said, we were standing at the door saying, we're Americans. We're here to take you out of here. And the more we said that, the more they pulled away from us. Chances are, we're not going to experience that kind of fear in this community. I mean, just chances are pretty slim that that's the kind of fear that would enter our world, right? And that real world scene. And it would be really silly for me to say that well, since you don't have that kind of fear that might enter your world, you really shouldn't fear anything at all. That would just be silly. Because while you don't face that, here's what I know, here's what you know. We do face a list of fears every day, right? Marriages that continually struggle. No shame, right? It's some of us are in marriages and we just continue to battle each other and we're trying to figure it out. And you kind of live with a little bit of fear of how the thing's going to turn out. Spouses that may cheat on you. It's always a possibility, right? Infertility, being painful. A huge problem in our area. Cars getting wrecked, cancer is a real thing, right? Jobs fail or we lose them. And then when all of that happens, we look out and we look at everybody else, and what do? We start comparing again, and the fears just grow that we'll never get back to the place of comfort, the place we want to be. There's a TV show, I think it's still on. In fact, I know it is. Probably many of you don't watch it, but back in the day, it served as my major source of ideas for youth ministry. It was called Fear Factor. I love that show. If you were squeamish, you probably don't love or watch that show. One of the highlights, one of the highest rated viewer episodes was this episode. If you don't know anything about the show, they put contestants through obstacles, but they interject little fear elements along the way. One of the obstacles was for a pair of people, two people, one to go over to one fish tank and read the numbers at the bottom of the fish tank. The other person was to go over to the other fish tank and enter the numbers in on a cell phone that was glued to the bottom of the fish tank. The added elements were the first fish tank was covered in about 6 to 8 inches of live maggots squirming around. Yeah, see, I just ruined some of your day. I'm sorry. The other fish tank was covered in live tarantulas. So that was the element. You had to overcome the fear. Could you do that? Could you move gently the maggots around, read the numbers at the bottom of the tank, relay them to your partner? Was they shoveled the tarantulas out of the way and entered the numbers on the phone? That is debilitating for some people. Some people can't even do that. How do you overcome fears? How do you overcome fears that aren't even associated with those kind of real world things, that maybe they're just associated with the way you interpret something in life? Do you know our fears are changing? The fears in our culture are changing. As people, we're changing some of the things we're afraid of. We're not changing them as much as it's happening to us. Back in 2015, a survey was done through Johns Hopkins University of young people, children. And from 1985 to 2015, the fears changed drastically. In 1985, their fears were things like this: animals, being in a dark room, high places, strangers, or loud noises. In 2015, the fears were divorce, nuclear war, cancer, pollution, or being mugged. Those fears are changing. So it's not always real, tangible things like a tarantula that you can just avoid, right? Fears are changing, and now what's happening is our fears are coming from our impressions and our judgments of people. I was in a conversation recently where a lady said, I was walking down the street and a guy walked past me, and then all of a sudden I felt him just kind of do a pivot and turn, and he started walking behind me, and she said, I got really afraid. Somebody in the conversation said, did you think that maybe he walked past you, forgot his cell phone in his car, and then just turned around and was going back to his car? And she goes, no, I never thought that. I was just afraid. What do you do when those fears start to enter your life? What do you do when you get up every day and there's little things you worry about to the point that it probably keeps you from behaving or doing or living into your life the way you could? I want to go this morning to one verse in particular, and it's from the book of 2 Timothy. Paul's letter to Timothy. It's a great little 2-letter book that's in there in the New Testament. So 1 Timothy and then 2 Timothy. Paul is writing to Timothy, and here's the thing. He's instructing young Timothy. He's trying to help him grow up. Paul is this saged person of the faith by now. He understands something. He's been through some hard things, and he's trying to transfer some of this wisdom to Timothy, and he's trying to encourage him and build him up. And here's what he knows. He knows that Timothy's probably, as he serves God, he's probably going to enter some really scary moments in life. He's probably going to be without food. He's probably going to be hungry. He might even be put in prison. He might be beaten. He might be stoned. He might lose his life, right? Again, not things that we expect to have happen to us in North Dallas, but these are real fears of his day. So as he's writing, Paul's telling Timothy, I want you to lean into your faith. I want you to continue to stretch yourself. I want you to push yourself so your faith continually grows. And in 2 Timothy 1:7, here's what he says. He says, the reason I want you to live into it, I want you to push yourself. For God gave us a spirit, not of fear, but of power and love and self-control. Unfortunately, I think when you hear that verse quoted, a lot of times it's quoted in a way like this, that the quote is, be encouraged to achieve the big task. You're going to win at this thing. God really wants you to win. That's how I hear it. I've seen it on cards. I've seen it used at graduations or sporting events. And the thing is, Paul is simply writing and reminding Timothy of what's happened to him. of what it means that God is in his life. He's not telling Timothy how to win at the big things. He's telling Timothy how he can be encouraged through all of the tough things in life. He's encouraging Timothy. Keep following Jesus, right? Probably the disciples were at one time in the same boat, except they had Jesus walking with them. And as Paul wrote this, I thought to myself, I wonder if Paul was thinking back to a conversation that one of the disciples had with him. When one of the disciples said, hey, Paul, there was this time that Jesus was getting ready to send us out into ministry, kind of like you're going to send Timothy out. And when he was going to send us out, Jesus said something to us. And maybe Paul, maybe this is a good thing to remember. Matthew 10:28. Jesus said, don't fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both the soul and the body in hell. Jesus never told the disciples, you're never going to be afraid. He never told the disciples it's wrong to be afraid. He told the disciples, if there's a fear out there to have, fear what could happen if you turn away from me. Fear what could happen if somebody tries to entice you away from me. Fear what it would be like to be in eternity without me. Don't necessarily stay in this place of fear just because you're going to die. He didn't say you're never going to fear. He didn't say you're never going to make it through all this ministry stuff without some kind of bad thing happening to you. He said, don't fear that as much as you would fear this over here. You ever, when you were a kid, have your mom be the one that was at home with you more during the summers? Like if your mom maybe didn't work, or she worked a job where she could stay home in the summers. My wife worked a job where she could stay home in the summers with our kids. And in the summers, in those moments, when they would push your buttons a little bit, and you used to do this to your parents, right? You would push your buttons. One time, one of my siblings, my mom said, stop pushing it. And they said, pushing it. And they started singing that song, Pushing It. Man, it was not good in our house that day. But you ever get in a situation, remember that, where maybe you pushed mom just a little bit too much? And mom said what? I mean, mom was scary, right? Mom could handle herself. But mom said, just wait until who gets home? Dad. Yeah, like mom was to be feared, but dad was to be feared. Like you just didn't cross it. And if you crossed that line, you knew life was over for the next week, right? Like it was going to be a problem for you. Jesus didn't say you're never going to encounter bad things. He didn't say life's never going to be bad. He said, don't fear this as much as you would fear this, leaving this earth without me. Because there's something beyond this life. These fears that are going on right here, right now, they're for a short time, but there's something else beyond that. And he says, you don't want to do that. You don't want to leave this life without me. I think that's what Paul's doing. I think Paul's looking at young Timothy and he's like, hey, there's going to be a lot of bad things out there. Things that can happen to you, but you have a different source of encouragement. You have a way to think and live through this that's different than the rest of the world. I've heard people, you ever heard this said that fear is the opposite of faith? You ever heard that statement? I've heard that before. That fear is the opposite of faith. If you just have faith, then you won't have any fear. I don't think that's right. I heard a pastor say this, and I believe it. I think here's what it is. Fear is faith in the wrong things. I think fear is having faith in the wrong things. Even if it's for a momentary second of your life where all of a sudden something happens to you and you're distracted for a minute, you forget whose you are and whom you belong to, and you kind of have this fear take over your life. But it consumes you in a way that it shouldn't. I thought I found a great illustration of this, so I'm gonna rely on one of the greatest theologians ever, Justin Bieber. Don't laugh. A couple months ago, Justin, there's his post. You can see it. I'll pull it out for you. A couple months ago, Justin put up a post that I thought was one of the most brutally raw and honest posts I've ever seen. I love this. He said, God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and of a sound mind. And then he wrote this, I haven't believed the truth about myself. I haven't believed I am loved. I haven't believed I am forgiven. It's a hard thing for me to wrap my mind around. Is that great? Now, listen, I don't know what you think about this guy. Maybe you hate his music. Maybe you love his music. Maybe you think he's full of it, or I don't know what you think. You have an opinion. I'm just telling you, when I read this, I thought this is one of the most brutally honest and raw responses for somebody who, by the way, is trying to figure out their faith in a very public way. And I think it's spot on. That we can get distracted sometimes, right? We can get distracted and not believe what God has told us who we are. And that's where that fear and anxiety will come from. If you don't believe you're loved, if you don't believe that you're forgiven, if you don't believe that God has a future for you, if you don't believe that future's secure, I think this is going to feed the fears, right? Now, we're all going to have fears at various times in our lives, but the question is, like young Timothy, do you have a Paul around you that says, hey, don't forget, the God who's in you, the God you serve, is bigger than all of this. So yeah, you might be afraid for just a second. You might be distracted for a second, but be encouraged by this other thing. Fear is the result of faith in the wrong things. And if that's true, then listen, overcoming fear is not, watch this, it's not this easy. It's not this easy of saying, well, just pray about it. You ever get that response? You know, if you're afraid about that, you just go pray. You spend a little extra time in prayer. I don't like those kinds of responses. It's not just saying get over it. I'm not saying don't pray. Prayer is a good thing, right? But it's just not that easy. If you've believed, if you've put your faith in some of the wrong things, and that's where fear is coming from in your life, then you're going to have to work to unwind some of that. And some of it is having our thoughts just completely transformed. Two things I want you to pay attention to. The first is this, that if you want to overcome fear, you got to discover what you value most in life. You got to do some soul searching. You got to really start to let God show you, or even ask yourself and just be brutally honest, what is it I value most? If you're married, can I tell you something? Go ask your spouse what they think you value, and you're not going to like the answer, but it's probably going to be more correct than your first answer. What do you value most in life? Your kids? Helping them grow up and be healthy and strong, the safety of them in life? Your marriage? Trying to protect it, keep it secure from the junk that's in the world? How about your skill to make money? Some of you are gifted at making money. I'm gifted at spending. What is it that you value? None of those things are bad. So don't hear me say, oh, if I value this, Cecil's about to tell me it's a bad thing. I've got to change my values. None of those things are bad. What do we say? Fear is putting your faith in the wrong things. Sometimes we put our faith in things we value, and we have to be very careful. Look, at the end of the day, what's going to happen? All of those things will end. The things you value in this life can end if they're the wrong things. Our kids hopefully grow up and move out and move on, right? That's what we want. But things change when that happens. Your marriage, without sounding like a downer this morning, your marriage will end. Somebody will leave this earth first, one of you probably, and the marriage will be over at that point, right? Your money is not going with you. It will end. In this short space of time we call life opens up to another life and an eternity of celebration, possibly. And the question is, what do you value most? It's so easy. It feels like to value the stuff that's in the moment and not pay attention to the stuff that's in eternity, right? Now, why am I asking you what you value? Because the things you value can make you susceptible, right, to fears in your life. Write this down. What you value most often reveals where you trust God the least. What you value most often is the thing that reveals where you're going to trust God the least in your life. It's the place where fear is going to come in. Paul says to young Timothy, God didn't give us a spirit of fear. He gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power and love and self-control. The ability to be encouraged, the ability to walk in the middle of fearful things. No matter what you face in life, young Timothy, you can be encouraged. You can be strengthened by God. You can know that God loves you. You can stand with confidence. And he's not making light of fears. So he's not saying get over it. He's making much of God is what he's doing. He's not making light of your fears. He's making much of God. But look, fears are debilitating. And so when we hear get over it, you know what happens? It just makes us mad, right? It just makes me mad when I hear get over it. Because in that moment, there's something debilitating about where I'm at. And yes, my focus is off and my faith might be directed at the wrong things in life. But I don't need to be told just get over it. I need somebody to help me see a God who can help me get through it, right? Am I willing to learn to trust God? When you trust God, write this down. When you trust God, the source of your fears may not disappear. They may not go away. When you trust God, the source of your fears may not go away. The strength of your God comes into focus, though. The source of your fears may not go away. You might pray, you might read the Bible, you might be encouraged, you might have a friend speak something to you that's incredibly encouraging, but the source of that fear may not just disappear. The strength of your God should come into focus. That's what Paul's trying to do to Timothy. He says, I want to make sure your focus is in the right place. I want to make sure your focus is in the right place. If I was going to ask you the question this morning, to fill in the blank at the top of your flyer, I fear, what would you put in that blank? What would you write down? You don't have to write it down, especially if somebody's sitting next to you. You know, you're thinking, oh, I don't want them to see what I write down. Maybe you fear the person next to you. I hope not. What would you write down? If you can know what that is, if you're willing to be honest enough, then the question becomes, are you willing to focus on the strength of God in your life when that fear starts to arise? I'm not asking you, we don't believe around here that people are perfect. I'm not asking you to say, I'll never fear again. I'm asking you, by the power of the Spirit, are you willing to allow your focus to become different? Are you willing to allow your focus to be changed, to move off the right thing, off the wrong things, and onto the right things? To take your faith and stop putting it in the things that are going to disappear in this world and start putting it on the one who will never disappear. Are you willing to walk there this morning, this week? I want to go back to the SEAL team for just a second. The SEAL team arrives in the compound, and the story goes that they're standing at the door, but there's so many prisoners in this little cell, there's no way they can just carry them out. They're debilitated. They're on the floor. They're shrinking. They're huddled up on the floor. They're fearful. They're afraid that these people at the door are actually trying to trick them. Just give them any reason to shoot them. One of the SEAL team members, the one who's the friend of the folk singer that started telling the story, said he got an idea. He took his helmet off and he sat it on the ground. He took his weapons off and he sat them next to the helmet. And he went and he sat on the floor in the middle of the prisoners. And before long, he kind of just started to crawl up in a little ball, but he made sure that as he did it, he would scoot closer and closer to the prisoners around him until eventually he was touching some of the prisoners shoulder to shoulder. And as he did it, he kept his head up instead of down like they did, and he was looking for anybody that would look at him. And as they would start to look up, he would catch their eye, and he tried to make sure that his face showed no fear and no anxiety. He said, I just try to relax my whole facial expression and tried to look lovingly at them. And he said, eventually one looked at me, and then a second, and then a third, and before long they all started looking at me. And when they looked at him and realized that he was on their side, because no guard would ever get on the floor and do that, then he just simply said, we're Americans, we're here to take you out of here. Will you go with us? And the end of the story is that they all wind up on an aircraft carrier and they're safe. And this guy kind of becomes the hero of the story. Here's why I love that story. The best news about that story is that's exactly what God did for you. That's exactly what God did for us. Paul says it this way. He starts to say it this way in Ephesians. He says, "But God, being rich in mercy, because of his great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, even when we were in our own little prison, even when we were locked away, unable to help ourselves, unable to do anything for ourselves, unable to take care of our own sins, God had this mercy and love for us. He was pursuing us. He was coming after us." John says this. He goes, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son." God was rich in mercy, rich in grace, saw us imprisoned in a place we could never escape on our own. So what did he do? He came after us. He came after us. And he came to the earth, fully man, while being fully God. But he walked, and he ate, and he talked, and he slept, and he got dirty with us, and he cried. And like that SEAL team member, he crawled up on the floor and got as close to us as he could. That's what we're offering. It's not that there's nothing to fear in life. It's that a God, a holy God, the God of the universe, who stepped out of heaven, stepped out of eternity, and got down on the floor with us and said, "It's going to be okay. Come with me." That's what he's offering. It's not just get over your fears. Your fears are real. If I didn't name your fear this morning, I'm sure you've got things that I didn't even say this morning. There's something in your life that's bothering you, something that keeps you bound up. It gets your faith focused on the wrong things. So you're continually nervous. You don't rest well. You don't even attempt, listen, you may not even attempt, this may be some of you, you don't even attempt to pray. Because you're not going to walk there anymore, right? Like you know God's supposed to be real, but you're not going to get closer to him because you're not sure you can trust him, because it just feels like life continually gets worse. Somebody that the fears are just consuming you still this morning. Some of us, they consume us not that much. Some of us were just debilitated almost. The invitation is not to focus on the fears, but to focus on God. The invitation is to respond to the God who came after us, who came into that compound, came into that prison cell, crawled up on the floor next to you and said, "I'm here to take you out of here." When you know that God, the other fears kind of fall away. When you trust that God, the source of your fears may not disappear, but the strength of your God is going to come into focus, and you're going to be able to breathe in the middle of the worst things you thought you could never ever walk through. So the question is, can you be honest this morning? What do you value most? What is it that maybe you're putting your faith in the wrong things? Where is it that you're placing your faith in a place that God doesn't want it? Where is it you're placing your faith in a way that's creating fear and anxiety in your life? And are you willing to get to know God better? Are you willing to walk with him? Are you willing to identify that? And are you willing to focus on him and see that he really is better than all these fears that you have in your life? When that happens, Journey, you know what happens? Community groups come alive, small groups of people come alive, a church comes alive, because we have something to offer that CNN or any other Fox News that nobody else can take away from us. You hear me, because I'm going to get stronger on that over the next 12 months. When we come to grips with the strength of a God who came after us, we don't have to be afraid of the things of this world that might take our lives or take our freedoms. Let me pray for us.